This is just but one such case in South Africa. In the previous financial year, the Department of Social Development had reported more than 26,800 cases of child abuse and neglect, something that is, of course, of great concern. Let's unpack this now with Clinical Director at the Teddy Bear Clinic, Dr. Shaheda Omar, as well as children's rights activist Alfred Harris and Director of the Center for Child Law at the University of Pretoria, Karabo Ozah. We're going to start with you this evening, Shaheda. Thank you so much for joining us. Really do appreciate it. The case of the Newclare baby, 4-year-old, that had been seemingly forced on video to smoke an unknown substance by the child's mother, who appeared in court and, of course, made admissions to that fact. That's not an isolated case in South Africa, but certainly a deeply worrying case in South Africa. Where are we getting it wrong as a society, as an organized society in particular, where we have institutions that are meant to proactively protect children from such abuses?
Good evening and thank you. So if we're looking at where are we going wrong, I think the important thing to appreciate and understand that it's a collective effort. It's a whole of society effort. It's not the responsibility of one individual, a family, neighborhood, faith-based organizations, recreational facilities, educational institutions, social welfare, your Department of Social Development, Child Welfare Services. So it's a whole range of government departments and civil society organizations. And if we look at this particular case of the 4-year-old, I think we have to applaud and commend the community because they have actually stepped up and taken action, mobilized action, and the JMPD certainly responded immediately. They responded promptly, adequately, and appropriately, where this child who was found to be in need of care and at risk was removed and due diligence was followed. So again, if we look at where are we going wrong, we all need to step up. It's joining forces, holding hands together to ensure the safety of each and every child. We have to go back to basics, the fundamentals of the spirit of Ubuntu, where your child is my child. If we do not do that, certainly not going to make any difference. And I think also ensuring that adequate resources, skills are made available to law enforcement, to the NPA, to all the relevant authorities so that they are upskilled in order to respond effectively.
Yeah. Karabo, if we take a look at the Children's Act, Section 28 of the Constitution, as well as the Sexual Offences Act, we have to ask, are these jurisprudential instruments sufficient to protect our children against such acts?
Yes, thank you so much. So the law, we always hear that South Africa has a lot of beautiful laws, the Constitution, insofar as child protection is concerned. But the problem that we face is the implementation. Now, Shaheda has already highlighted the reactive, approach when we hear that there's a challenge in relation to the child and how there was a system that worked. But one of the key things that we are failing at and that we need to really look at is prevention. Because ideally, you shouldn't be having a situation where you end up with a child being exposed to this kind of lifestyle, this kind of, behavior by parents. And there is not enough resources, there are not enough social workers that are being put in the communities to make sure that children who are at high risks, where parents are really failing and struggling to look after their children, there's early intervention so that children are not exposed to very dangerous behavior by their parents. So the laws, as we always say, are very adequate. The implementation is a problem for various reasons. One is resources, but one of the things that worry us,
can I just pause you there before you go there? Do we have inculcated into our legal instruments preventative statutory obligation placed on our institutions so that we have things like early intervention, as you speak of?
Yes, it's definitely legislated in the Children's Act. The only challenge that we have is that the funding for it is discretionary. So, the Children's Act says that certain provisions are made for prevention, for intervention and all that. But when it comes to prevention, the funding from national and from the provincial government is made discretionary, not mandatory. And most of us who work in the space for long have been saying that is a problem because you can't just focus so much on reaction and not put resources into prevention. But prevention also means means that people must care. And one of the things, I'm a lawyer and we play the law, I mean, we apply the law and we're very hard on the law. But one of the things that worries me recently is that how do we legislate care? So all these provisions means that people must care. The people who are tasked with the obligation to actually provide preventative services must care. And that is on the decline. Doesn't matter how beautiful our laws are. As people who work on children's rights every day, one of the most critical and frustrating and saddening things is that there's lack of care for actually stepping up to prevent all these violations of children's rights.
Alfred, is there a vacuum of compassion in our institutions, as Karabo describes, that we need more care? Shaheda started off this conversation by saying, let's congratulate and acknowledge the quick response by the Metro Police in response to this. Karabo says, we need more of that. We need more of our institutions to care. Do we not have enough compassion inculcated into our instruments and institutions?
Evening to you, and to the viewers. I want to start with Dr. Shaheda Omar's point around community being responsible for caring. And the care that you are talking about is really a whole community care. Because remember, Oliver, that a government cannot have an eye in every home where children are. So we need to develop a sense of care in our communities. The issue that was raised around the policies. Yes, we have the most beautiful policies. What I often ask the question is, when policies are developed, are we also looking at how to cost those policies in order to make sure that when the policy is implemented, we have the resources available to implement the policy? I know the government is saying that we need to have 55,000 social service professionals by the year 2030, but do we have the institutions to be able to produce those number of social workers? Annually, I think that the universities at this country might be only producing a number of 3,000 social workers graduating every 4 years. So will that number be enough? That's one level. Then the other level is, Oliver and viewers, is that we need to look at how do we make sure that services reach the people, that there are enough services available for people. Government has got a policy of a district model of service delivery. Where in that model, you will find that they will make sure that there are enough services to provide for the community in terms of the needs of that community. Now, those are all good policies, Oliver, but the implementation of those policies is lacking. And one of the biggest things that is hampering the implementation, as we're all sitting around this table, no, it is resources. We don't have enough resources to employ the kind of people that we need.
Can I just pause you there, Alfred? Can I just pause you there before you make your last point? Karabo, you problematize this resource problem as one where the fiscal instrument is a discretionary instrument. What is the antidote to that?
Well, we have proposed, I mean, there's been several proposed amendments to the Children's Act, and there are even now recently adopted amendments, and there are ones that are ongoing where a bill is going back before the committee to look at some of the proposed amendments over the years. And one of the proposed amendments was in relation to this funding of prevention and early intervention services. Now, I'm not too hopeful that they may, because the Children's Act says that they may be funding for prevention and early intervention, and we are proposing that most of our organizations working on these issues that it must be a must. I don't know whether we'll get it. You know the challenges around post-COVID, money is tight and all those things, and Treasury is not giving enough money. There are already so many challenges to even funding of existing NPOs to help with prevention. But we really need to push for it. And to some extent, it may require us going to courts and getting the courts to say to government, well, you need to review your policies. I mean, you have us here tonight. And when I was preparing for this interview, I thought about where is government coming to tell you and tell the country what are they doing to turn the tide on some of these issues. And we need to start questioning that accountability from government. It cannot be that COVID came and took funds away and now we're still there. No, it can't be, because the stats around child abuse, child neglect, and violations of children's rights require them to come and account as to What are they doing to change the laws, to change the funding models and the policies? And I agree with Alfred. One of the key things that's been there since the Act had been adopted was that there must always be costing of implementation. And that is something that must be done so that then the funds are available to make sure that we can then provide the services. And government is failing, and they must come and account.
Yeah, do we actually know? I mean, Shaheda, you're on the ground. Your organization works quite literally with children and families that are vulnerable. What does it cost to keep our children safe? Do we have an idea of what that reflection should be in our fiscal instruments?
Unfortunately, we don't have a realistic cost. We can speak to the services we provide, a journey to healing, where we take a child through different services, a child who has entered the criminal justice system or has entered psychosocial support. So just to take a child for a month, we're looking at over 20,000 Rand, and that's a few services that would be provided. But that excludes transporting the child, the parents bringing the child. So taking into consideration, it is much higher, and it is something that we need to cost. And I think Karabo and Alfred raised a very important point in terms of the lack of resources. So people not having access and availability. If we look at historically disadvantaged communities, peri-urban, rural areas, people have to make a tough decision around putting a loaf of bread on the table or accessing psychosocial support, medical legal support for their child who has been a victim of abuse. And this is definitely something that we need to put on a systemic lens, because even if we look at the landscape of the communities that we are talking about, we need to look at the under-resources, the lack of infrastructure, the lack of opportunities, the poverty, the unemployment, the overcrowding, and just surrounded by violence. Violence begets violence, and the gangsterism that children are faced with, that becomes the law and norm. It's an order of the day where shooting and killing seems to be what people live by. The normalization of pathology and toxicity in these communities. So a systemic lens with a proactive view on addressing this, but government has to come to the party, like Karabo and Alfred alluded to.
Alfred, do we have any literature available that can help us point us in the direction, at least help lawmakers and policymakers point in the direction of what the cost of keeping our children safe would be?
Karabo, I'm sorry, Oliver, when the Children's Act was implemented, there was a costing exercise for the implementation of the Children's Act. That was presented to government, and government had 3 levels of implementation: a low, a medium, and a high level. And obviously, looking at the fiscus and looking at what they can afford, they obviously went for the medium implementation. And the point that is being made here by Karabo around the prevention services, there is a notion that prevention doesn't work. Prevention in a developmental state just takes time. It just takes time, but if you allocate the correct resources to implement those programs, because the Children's Act, and it's Karabo, so right, the Children's Act says it's May. So it means that government, national and provincial governments can decide whether they want to implement it or not. And I just want to bring a point of clarity also here, Oliver, and to the panel members. It's that we often forget that it's not only the social workers who is responsible to provide services to children. We have other professionals in the social service sector, which is child and youth care workers, community development practitioners, who work alongside social workers in order to provide services to our vulnerable children and families. And when we come to costing, one of the things that we must get right is, and your question is so relevant, what does it cost to keep a child safe? Now, if the only costing one can go on is to look at what does it cost for government to keep a child in a facility versus what it costs an NGO to keep a child in a facility. And that costing will really give you an idea of what it costs to keep a child safe in alternative care. Then, Oliver and viewers, when we look at keeping children safe in their communities, the one thing we need to do is that, and I think Karabo spoke about reactive, and that is so sad, because even with this young boy smoking, I'm sure somebody has spoken about that mother, because that could not have been the first time that happened. But the person who spoke to the mother or to a friend about that didn't have the guts to say, where do I go and report it? So the other thing that people need to know and be made aware of is that we all in this country, according to the Children's Act, have a responsibility to report suspicion of child abuse. Not the act of child abuse, but just a suspicion of child abuse, and social workers will have to go in and investigate that. And if it's just a simple thing of alerting the authorities, it will make a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, 41% of children in South Africa, adolescents in particular, use alcohol, and 28% use cannabis. Both of those are illegal, and communities just watch that go by. Karabo, maybe a last question for us to explore here. Again, speaking to the heart of our jurisprudential instruments, particularly when it comes to holding perpetrators accountable, there's a sentiment across the country in various sectors that perhaps minimum prescribed sentencing needs to be lifted or relooked at when it comes to sentences around child molestation, child abuse, and child neglect. Would that be sufficient in turning the tide, at least from an accountability perspective?
So, I mean, I'm not sure if I'm understanding the question correctly. The minimum sentences actually that we have are quite strict. So, and actually we're put in place recognizing the special vulnerability or the vulnerability of children, persons with disability and stuff. So we already have quite strict provisions in relation to if somebody is found guilty of an offense against a child, the starting point and the minimum sentences. Now, the challenge that we're seeing is that when those are applied and when can the courts deviate is obviously always subject to the court and the matter before them. And there has been questions about the challenges pertaining to courts deviating from minimum sentences and not really fully substantiating that. So that is a challenge, because obviously you have to make, for the law to work, it must be implemented properly. And in most instances, if you're not going to apply it as it says, you must then sufficiently explain why. Now that's where the challenge is. In criminal cases, obviously, you can't say because Karabo committed this crime and another person committed the same crime, they'll get the same sentences because our circumstances are not the same. But accountability and explanation as to why you deviated is the key thing. And we have seen in recent judgments that there are questions about was the court correct to deviate from the prescribed minimum sentences? And that's where we need to do research. That's another thing. We need to monitor these court outcomes. We need to assess them. We need to say whether there are challenges with, the sensitization of judges and magistrates around violence against children, and how do we train to make sure that even at that level, you have people being really knowledgeable about when to apply that and apply it in a correct way. Because also, if you don't do it properly, you have people actually going to higher courts and having their sentences being set aside, and then they therefore getting away with having committed very serious crimes against children. So implementation is always where the challenge lies, but we need to also invest in monitoring the implementation and actually being able to say, this is not working, that's not working, this is where we need to improve.
Can I just pause you there, Karabo?
In my view.
Can I just pause you there, because we are out of time, but Shaheda, I just want you to give me a short and quick response to this. How do we get this onto the top of the agenda of the national dialogue?
Well, I think we need nothing about us without us. And I think we need to look at the victims, the survivors here. Their voices need to be brought to the fore, bringing the voiceless of the voice and hearing from them what the way forward is, the best way forward is hearing from these community members who are suffering from the trauma, and turning the tide of this trauma, because enough is enough. When is enough not enough? And this is where we need to get those voices to the fore to ensure that the government listens to them and responds to them, because it's beyond discussion now. This is a national pandemic.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Shaheda. Always fantastic speaking to you. Dr. Shaheda Omar is Executive Director of the Teddy Bear Clinic. Karabo Ozah, who is the Director of the Center for Child Law at the University of Pretoria, as well as child rights activist Alfred Harris. Thank you so much for your insights. Really do appreciate it. Yeah, let's take you to this now. Very important.